Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is illegal. It threatens global security. It's caused colossal human suffering. Over 35,000 civilians have been killed or injured, 6 million forced to flee, and almost 20,000 Ukrainian children forcefully deported, kidnapped, to put it bluntly. And I wonder how Russia can show its face in this building. 600,000 Russian soldiers have been killed or wounded in this war. And for what?
Some tough words on Russia there from the Prime Minister at the United Nations General Assembly in September. That was, of course, before the election of Donald Trump, which has once again upended international relations. How does Keir Starmer deal with this? Hello, you're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Today we're talking about the big conversations facing Keir Starmer at the G20 summit in Brazil.
Well, Russia's war in Ukraine will be a key topic of discussion there as the world tries to understand what Donald Trump's election will mean for that conflict. Will he, as he has said before, be able to end the conflict in one day? And how? We just don't know. Meanwhile, in one of his final acts as president, Joe Biden's given the green light for Ukraine to use long-range missiles supplied by the US to strike inside Russia. How can the UK position itself as pressure grows towards starting negotiations that might end the conflict?
So that's one of the key conversations we'll be watching to see what progress might be made at the G20. Another important meeting Keir Starmer has in the diary already is with China's President Xi Jinping. He's going to be the first British Prime Minister to meet a Chinese president since Theresa May in 2018. Now, he says that he wants to thaw relations in a bid to drive economic growth, but is that something that might put him in opposition with a Trump White House if he's cozying up to China?
Yeah, plenty of big issues and delicate conversations for the Prime Minister in Brazil. In a post-Brexit Trump tariff world, how does Britain position itself? How can Keir Starmer's balance in terms of the relationships with its allies match up with also standing up to our enemies?
Let's bring in our UK politics editor Alex Morales for more on this. Alex, you've spent many years following Keir Starmer around events and meetings like this, and of course other prime ministers as well. How well suited is Keir Starmer for these sorts of conversations? How does he play it when he's in a room with people like the Chinese president?
He's not the sort of Prime Minister that, say, Boris Johnson was, who sort of charms people and makes jokes, but he's a very serious person and he deals with these things kind of pragmatically. Like, I think his whole approach is to try and maintain cordial relations, even with people who are sort of on the opposite side of the political spectrum from him. And I suspect that's exactly what he'll do on the international stage.
What are Keir Starmer's, indeed what are Britain's options when the world is now more dangerous, more fractured than ever?
Well, I think the guiding principle's got to be keep your friends close. I hesitate to say keep your enemies closer, but certainly you're seeing he's made quite clear that he wants to bring the UK much closer to the European Union than it is, within the constraints of the fact that we've Brexited already. He wants to keep the US close as well, and that includes with the Trump administration. You know, he had a 2-hour dinner with Donald Trump last month or a couple of months ago. You know, the US and the EU are very much the core of Britain's relations. And obviously, you know, you throw in your Australia, Canada, and a few other sort of liberal democracies. I think he'll also try and, as we're seeing in the G20 now, sort of get a rapprochement with countries like China, which is sort of important to how the globe operates and how Britain's international relations operate.
The China meeting is going to be a very interesting one as well, because, you know, we mentioned that it's the first one in several years that a UK Prime Minister has had with a Chinese president, but it's coming at a time when we know that US-China relations are going to be difficult under Donald Trump based on what he said so far. The European Union's in this in-between position where they're worried about their own industries, they're worried about subsidies for Chinese electric vehicles, for example. So that's sort of an economic issue that's weighing on political relations too. I mean, how does the UK play this to try and warm up to China if that's what Keir Starmer hopes to achieve?
I don't think there's a huge amount of difference between the Tory approach and the Labour approach under Starmer. I think he's trying to get the UK a bit closer. He's seeking that rapprochement. But, you know, there were already the beginnings of that under the Tories. James Cleverly visited China last year when he was Foreign Secretary. So I think Again, it goes back to this word pragmatic, which Starmer himself uses when he describes the relationship he's trying to seek with China. Britain's cognizant that there are some real threats coming from China. There's the economic threat. There's also, Britain's accused China of hacking into loads of national computer systems. So I think he's cognizant of the danger China poses, but he's also cognizant that, it's the second biggest economy in the world. If you want to tackle something like climate change, which is big on Keir Starmer's agenda, you need to be speaking to China because it's the biggest emitter in the world. So it's work with China in areas where you can, whilst maintaining those sort of suspicions where you have to.
Yeah, it's an amazingly difficult balancing act, isn't it? Meanwhile, the UK government in power since July, Donald Trump now in the White House from January, and this question of Ukraine. Again, there's a difficult position for Britain that has been an ardent supporter of Ukraine's fight against Vladimir Putin. How is Starmer going to deal with this situation?
So in terms of the Trump relationship, I mean, as I mentioned before, he's already had a 2-hour meeting with Trump. The men seemed to get on. I mean, obviously there weren't journalists in the room, but both camps reported back that it was a friendly and cordial affair. We've had a Trump administration before, and fine, it was a Conservative administration in the UK, but it was Theresa May, and she had a very difficult relationship with Donald Trump. So Trump seems to have a certain degree of respect for Starmer because of the size of the majority he got. And I think Starmer will again, I come back to the word pragmatic again. He's going to seek to work with Donald Trump in areas where he can. And I'm sure he'll be trying to imprint his position on climate change, on Ukraine, where there are apparently quite large differences, and he'll wield whatever influence he can.
I did notice that, and it was featured in our reporting over the weekend as well, that when that call happened between Trump as president-elect and Keir Starmer as well, he did call Keir Starmer's mobile rather than necessarily doing it on a desk phone, which sort of presented a slightly different optic of Keir Starmer sort of staring at his mobile phone while talking to the president-elect, which I thought was an interesting image to set up this relationship.
I think also there are probably security implications about calling on his mobile rather than a secure landline.
But doesn't it speak to sort of a different set of relations where it is, like a bit sort of text your mates brand of diplomacy, of going straight, that sense of informality, which could be an interesting dynamic when Donald Trump takes over in the White House as well. And it seems like that those issues around, there had been complaints, of course, about Labour Party members getting involved in the campaign for Kamala Harris. That doesn't appear to have featured since Donald Trump actually was elected.
No, not at all. So Trump at heart is an Anglophile. And you saw that in his last presidency. He was a particularly huge fan of the late Queen. He sort of likes the pageantry of old Britain. His mother was Scottish. He owns a golf course in Scotland. I think, obviously, his approach is always going to be America first, and he's made that quite clear. But if he were to look on a country favourably, the UK is well placed to get that favourable treatment.
Yeah, the person who doesn't seem much of an Anglophile, though, is Elon Musk, who has sent several posts sort of attacking the British government since getting that top job in the Trump administration. And he's also had some kind of battles, for example, with the Labour mayor of London and a number of others. He's been quite pointed in his criticism. How does Starmer deal with, the world's most mercurial, richest person?
I think probably he has to carry on much as he has been, sort of limiting statements to his spokesman rather than himself, not making direct personal attacks on Elon Musk. But also, I mean, Elon Musk's role in Trump's White House, my understanding is sort of internal, sort of national focused role. So it's not a foreign affairs role. But yeah, I mean, it's obviously a difficult thing to manage because what do you do? He's the world's richest man. He owns a very influential social media platform, and he seems to have a particular antagonism towards the UK.
Yes, that'll be an interesting one to watch as well. Are there banana skins in the ether for Keir Starmer at an event like the G20? We've talked about, he has a planned meeting with the Chinese, so that's obviously been very much planned out. Of course, he'll have things to say about the US and on Ukraine, but are there other issues that we should be thinking about that could potentially pop up during those discussions?
Well, I mean, I assume the Middle East will come up, the situation in Israel and Gaza. And clearly that's a difficult one domestically for Keir Starmer because there's a sort of groundswell of support amongst the left for the plight of the Gazans, whilst he's been fairly robust in his support of Israel. But the UK has increasingly stepped up criticisms of Israel's actions in Gaza.
I want to throw in one sort of thought also. Nigel Farage, this came up also in our weekend reporting. Are there chances that it could actually end up being Nigel Farage and the Reform UK party that ends up getting the ear of Trump, in the White House, and therefore that adds kind of political power to the party in Britain.
I mean, Farage already has Trump's ear. So, I mean, yes, that probably does give him a little bit of an edge in terms of his position in Britain because it makes him more prominent. Trump called out during the campaign, he called out attention to Nigel Farage in the audience of one of his rallies. So, obviously that gives Farage a bit more sort of prominence nationally within the UK. And he's quite clear after the general election in July that now he dealt with the Tories and now he was coming for Labour. So, yes, I'm sure we'll hear a lot more from Nigel Farage, especially as the next election gets closer.
Okay, and we will be watching closely for developments on that front, but also to see what news emerges from the G20 meeting in Brazil. Our UK politics editor, Alex Morales, thanks very much for joining us and talking us through. I mean, look, it's a very long list of geopolitical issues that are on the agenda, they're both pressing and extremely important. And this is where watching an event like this, because often G20s don't produce necessarily concrete results on a lot of big issues, but they do provide a forum for face-to-face conversations and warming of relations. So for a new Prime Minister, this becomes even more significant.
Yes, and the G20 has become steadily more prominent, and certainly since the 2008 global financial crisis, that's really when it kind of came to the fore as a venue. Look, I just think it's fascinating that compared to President Donald Trump, the reaction and response in many places, I think perhaps even including the UK, is to try to steady the ship and to think about what are the certainties versus what is a transition period into potentially an uncertain White House in terms of their policies.
Well, that's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo. Our audio engineer was Meredith Frank. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.